this page. Every chapter starts with kind of a case study or something that's supposed to be interesting. So hopefully you like red pandas, because that's what this one's about. I think they're super cute. Kung Fu Panda, anybody? Yeah, Master Shifu, he's a red panda. Okay. So by the end of the chapter, you should be able to explain why a red panda's classification has changed. So when you think red panda, what else do you think of? Pandas, right? So scientists used to group pandas and red pandas together, but they don't anymore. So by the end of the chapter, after you're done looking at it, you should be able to tell why. Okay. The big reason, though, is that rather than looking at where they live or what they eat, because they both eat bamboo, they both live in kind of the same general area, they're looking at things like DNA sequences. So when you look at DNA sequences, it looks like the red panda's in its own family all by itself. So now the red panda is classified on its own. It's the only living relative of its family. And the giant panda's in a different family. Okay, so here's a cute little red panda. These guys are really hard to study, apparently. They're really shy, and so we don't even really necessarily know where they live or what all their habits are. So this is something, if you decided you wanted to, you could try to go into and study the red panda in their natural habitat. Okay, that could be fun. Page 2. You should be able to tell me why life is life. So what are the characteristics of life? Okay, as we go through, so this is what I'm calling these sticky note lectures. So you might want to write down what's on the sticky notes. Or you can go back and listen to the lecture and then take notes kind of as you are reading if you feel like this is not enough time for you to write stuff down. Okay, so it's up to you how you want to do it. But all of these are characteristics of life. So stuff that's alive should be able to reproduce. It has some order and structure. There's growth and development. Okay, it has to process energy, so it takes in energy but also expels some energy. Lots of the time that just is heat. Okay. Things that are alive have to respond to the environment. If it gets cold, they do something. If there's an earthquake, they probably do something. Okay. Stuff that's alive should be able to adapt. So over time, looking at hundreds of years, thousands of years, organisms will change based on the conditions that they're exposed to. And they have to be able to regulate themselves. So that would be involving the idea of homeostasis and trying to always keep things in balance. Okay, so get rid of wastes, take in new food, things like that. Okay. So you should know that. On page 3, this talks about the domains. You should know what those 3 domains are. So there's domain bacteria, there's domain archaea, and there's domain eukarya. Both domains, bacteria and archaea, have simpler cells. So they're cells that are called prokaryotes. We'll talk more about that later. Domain eukarya has eukaryotes. Hopefully those terms sound familiar, but if not, again, we'll talk about those, okay? But you should know those 3 things. So for us, what domain would we be in? Yeah, eukarya. We have complex cells, okay? We have eukaryotic cells. Most animals are going to be in domain eukarya. Most plants would be in domain eukarya. So the domains bacteria and archaea really are pretty much just bacteria and other single-celled organisms. So they can be really interesting, but when people think biology, that's not usually what they think of. Okay. Next page. This is kind of both pages at the same time, okay? Because this is different levels of organization. So we're going to start with number 10, which is actually on page 5. Number 10 is the molecule. This is a really small level. What would be smaller than a molecule? Right. So that's not listed. We could list that as an 11th level if we wanted. And then we could go smaller than that and talk about the parts of an atom. But we're talking about molecules. When you put those together, then we can look at organelles. When you put all those together, then you would look at cells. A bunch of cells that work together are tissues. A bunch of tissues that work together make up organs and the systems of organs. So like the nervous system, that's what's highlighted here in this fish. Or we could talk about the circulatory system or their integumentary system. It's a skin. It's a fun one. In general, for these levels, you just need to be able to identify what level something's at. So if we're talking about just a fish, that would be an organism. If we go higher than that and we look at the population, that would be all of that type of fish in the coral reef or something like that. Okay, so this is how population and community differ from the way we normally use them. Community is all the organisms in an ecosystem. So if the coral reef is the ecosystem we're looking at, it's the different populations or how the different species interact with each other that makes up the community. When you look at ecosystem, that adds in the physical components of whatever the habitat is. So that's what is the coral reef built on? Is it in warm water or cold water? Is it acidic water or is it basic water? Stuff like that. What are the properties of the area that are non-living? Okay, so the abiotic factors. Then we have the biosphere, which is all the life, just all the life, all the things. Okay. You don't have to be able to define all of those, but again, you should be able to say, if I tell you about a group of apes, what level that would be at. So if we're talking about a group of apes, what level is that at? That would be population. Okay. If we're talking about the Indiana sand dunes, what level would that be? That's at the level of an ecosystem. Okay, so you should be able to identify that. Okay, the last thing from these 2 pages is a vocabulary term that comes up. It's called emergent properties. You should be able to explain that concept. It's pretty straightforward. It's the idea that as you go from a simpler level to a more complex level, there are properties that show up that you don't see at the simpler levels. So if you're only looking at a cell, you don't know anything about what kind of tissue it is. So if we're just talking about your skin cell, then we're looking at, okay, what kinds of organelles does it have? How does the cell itself maintain homeostasis? But to go to the next level, then we're looking at how your skin cell works with the other skin cells to keep water out of your body or to keep bacteria out of your body. That's an emergent property. Okay. Moving on to the next page. If you have a question while I'm going, please ask. Okay. Page 6. You should know the characteristics of a scientific hypothesis. I took the time to just bullet point those out on my sticky notes. So they're based on observations. Okay, they should be testable. And they should be verifiable, which just means you should be able to do it over and over again. So if I do an experiment in my lab, you should be able to do the same thing in your lab and get the same results. Okay. This is the second sticky note. Science does not prove. This is something that's pulled out if you read through this text. Science can't prove something. Okay, so people will say, well, science has proven. You can say, science doesn't prove. Okay, that's a pet peeve for some people. If you're in something like AP Bio, or if you decide to take AP Bio in the future, you would not want to write on a question, science proves, because that is something that could potentially cause you to have the wrong answer. Okay, I'm not going to nitpick you though. If you do tell me science proves, I will jokingly tell you, no, it doesn't. Okay, but I'm not going to take off points. Okay, so science can support something or not support something, so it can help invalidate something. Moving on. Look, we have mice. I don't know if you know this, but different mice in different habitats do usually have different colorations. Okay, so the experiment that's described here is a controlled experiment. For controlled experiments, you should be able to tell the difference between the independent and the dependent variable. That's IV and DV. You should be able to describe a control group versus the experimental group or groups. So with this particular experiment, the researchers wanted to know if coloration affected when something was attacked, so whether it was preyed upon. So they took a bunch of plastic mice and painted them 2 different colors. They painted them white, like the mice by the beach, and then they painted them like a brownish color, like the mice that are inland. So they put half of each of those colors in both sets, in both habitats. So half of the mice that they put out and spread out by the beach were white, half of them were this brown color. Half of the mice they put inland were white, half of them were a brown color. And then they just tracked to see which ones were attacked and which ones weren't. Their data supported the idea that the color of the mice did affect whether or not they were attacked. So on the beach, the ones that were attacked were the brown ones, and inland, the ones that were attacked were the white ones. Okay, because the ones that were a different color stood out. So camouflage seems to make a difference. Does that make sense? Okay, it's pretty common to do experiments like that just to confirm that what we think is true is true. Okay. Moving on. And this is the part where you don't have to read the rest of this part of the book, which is great, okay? So the points of 1.6 through 8, they're kind of self-explanatory, which is what I put on the Post-it note. So the idea that you can test hypotheses with observations, okay? That's generally how we collect information. You don't always have to do experiments. Sometimes you can just observe things. So the observational data that's talked about here is the DNA sequences for the red panda. So the DNA sequence for a red panda is more similar to that of a raccoon than it is to a giant panda. So the raccoon and the red panda are actually more closely related than the red panda and the giant panda, based on the DNA sequences. 1.7, the process of science is repetitive, nonlinear, and collaborative. Science is messy. That's the idea that it's nonlinear. We don't always set out to discover what is found during an experiment. A lot of discoveries are made accidentally. You've probably heard of things like, I think Velcro might be one of them. People didn't intend to design Velcro, but by doing different experiments, they got Velcro and made a lot of money off of it. Okay. Or what? The microwave might be another one, yeah. Okay, there are a lot of things like that, though. A lot of technology is developed on accident. It should be repetitive. Again, you should be able to repeat the experiments. And then it's collaborative. A lot of scientists work together. It's not my secrets, my experiments. It's I'm working on this, you're working on the same thing. Let's work together and share our information. Okay. And after these two pages, so pages 10 through 16, talks about 5 themes. If you want, you can go through and read these if you want to look at a little bit more at what these are, but you don't really have to take specific notes on these because these are things we're going to come back to over and over again. So evolution's one. Okay, that topic's going to come up. If you don't remember what natural selection is, you should read for that definition, kind of that idea. What is natural selection, or what are adaptations? The flow of information. This is the idea that the genes of an organism are what determines their characteristics. So if something's not in the DNA, you wouldn't see an animal or an organism expressing that specific trait. So we start with the DNA, then that becomes RNA, then that becomes proteins, then that means that the organism acts or is able to act in a specific way. Okay, so that flow of information is important. Structure and function. Okay, you could use a hammer to cut a hole in the wall, but that's really not what the hammer is designed for. Okay, so that's how things work in biology too. There are certain organelles that do certain things because their structure fits what their function is. Energy and matter transfer and transformation. That's the idea that producers are producers and consumers are consumers, and what does that look like? So energy for life has to come from somewhere. Looking at the relationship of how energy gets from one organism to the next is an important part of biology. Okay, the last theme is systems interactions. And this is kind of related to the idea of emergent properties. As you go higher and higher in levels of organization, the entire system gets more complex, and you can look at how parts of the system interact with each other. So if we were going to talk about a watch, and we talk about all the pieces of the watch, that's great, but it doesn't work unless you put it all together. Okay, so that's your idea of systems interactions. I know that was a lot, but do you have any questions?